Welcome to BuildWriting, the podcast for writers who take the short form seriously. Whether you're working in poetry, flash fiction, or the short story, this is a space where craft gets the attention it deserves. I'm your host, Oyemichi Nwakonam, and today we're going deep into what it means to build a life around writing and around the writers who deserve to be heard. My guest today is Wayne Miller, poet, editor, professor, and one of the most quietly essential figures in American literary culture. He's the editor of Copper Nike, the acclaimed literary journal at the University of Colorado, Denver, where he also serves as professor and chair of English. He co-creates the Unsung Masters series, which rescues overlooked and out-of-print writers and puts them back into the hands of readers who need them. As poet, Wayne has published 6 collections. His most recent, The End of Childhood, came out from Mickwood Editions in 2025. Wayne, welcome to BuildWriting.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. I would love for you to take us back to the beginning. When did poetry stop being something you read and start being something you had to write?
Well, yeah. So I grew up in Ohio, in Cincinnati, Ohio, kind of mid-sized Midwestern city. And I was very lucky. I had a high school English teacher who taught some poetry. I mean, a lot of English teachers don't, or they teach the minimum required. And I had a pretty lonely childhood. I was a only child of a single mother, and poetry just seemed like it had value. I could say things. My poems that I wrote at that stage were terrible, but they were meaningful to me in that, I was able to say things. And so when I went off to college, the one thing I knew is that I wanted to go somewhere where I could take a creative writing class. And I ended up going to a college near Cleveland called Oberlin College, where I ended up studying. I was very lucky to study with Stuart Freebert and David Young and Martha Collins. And what's important to me about all three of them is that, besides the fact that they're terrific writers and people, is that they all were translators too. So very early in my education as a writer and a reader, I was introduced to work in translation and to the idea that translation is itself an artistic process, is itself its own art form. And so after I graduated from college, I ended up with a job in New York City. I was a paralegal, and I was writing more than I did as a college student. And that's when I thought, okay, this is something that I'm serious about. No one's telling me I have to do this. I'm still doing this. And so at that point, I applied to graduate school, and I ended up going to Houston, Texas to do a Master's of Fine Arts. When I finished my MFA, I stumbled into a teaching job in rural Missouri at a school called University of Central Missouri, where I ended up working alongside the wonderful poet Kevin Proofer. We edited Pleiades magazine together. I never thought I would be an editor, but I ended up in grad school working on Gulf Coast and then at Pleiades, and then I came to Colorado for Copper Nickel, and editing has really turned out to be central to my professional world. So that's the short version.
You moved from, the guy in school who had a great English teacher to the guy writing paralegal work, and then to the guy writing poetry, and then taking an MFA, and then becoming a professor of English, teaching others people how to write, and then now you're editing other people's work. It seems like the career was planned.
It was very lucky. I really thought after my MFA I would go to law school or something like that. My dad was an English professor, and the last thing I wanted to do was be an English professor. But it turns out that that's what I just stumbled into these, I stumbled into that job in Missouri, and the kind of law that I was interested in practicing would have been either sort of, civil rights law or criminal law, something, I didn't want to do corporate law where all the money is. And so it turns out being a professor, you make about the same as a low-level attorney. So I just figured, why go back to law school? I already had a good job.
Oh, yeah. Short form writing, poetry, which you write, it demands a level of compression. Every word has to earn its place. Was that a discipline you learned, or did it come naturally to you to allow every word speak volume?
That's a great question. I think I'm pretty obsessive on the page. When I try to write prose, I don't, and I rarely try to write prose, but when I try to write prose, I get to the end of the first page and my immediate impulse is to go back and obsess over every word choice on that page. I had a friend who's a novelist who used to say that you write your first 100 pages of a novel without ever reading or editing anything, just to get the first 100 pages done, and then you can go back. I could never do that. That would make me crazy. So I think that desire to try to control and perfect every word as best I can, to go and, I mean, I read my poems out loud to myself a lot as I'm drafting them. That idea that, the way the poem sounds, the way the poem looks, the effects of the juxtapositions of words, the way stanzas interact with each other, all of that kind of like micro layer control is just really compatible with the way I obsessively think about language on the page. So I love that you say compression, because for me, that's so much of what makes poetry poetry, is this micro level attention to compressing language till nothing can change about it.
Yeah, from the example you gave, it seems like, writing a novel, it's like trying to sculpture a mountain versus writing a poem is trying to sculpture a rock.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's a great metaphor.
Yeah. Well, you've published six collections over a career, and your most recent work, The End of Childhood. How's your relationship with the poem, as an art form changed from your first book, trying to put a couple of words together, to now you're like, you're poets. Yeah, you have works to support the claim.
Yeah, I think there's a moment that my work changed. So I think in my first two books, which are Only the Senses Sleep and the Book of Props, I my poems tended to be interested in what I would call defamiliarizing metaphors. I was very interested in the way in which a poem can capture images in the world at the moment we first apprehend them, when they're slightly unfamiliar, slightly, you see something and then there's a lag time. It's just maybe a quarter second between seeing it and your mind making sense of it. And I was interested in, often through metaphor, trying to like capture that moment of the thing seeming slightly unfamiliar. I thought that was sort of the transformation, the transformative work of poetry that I wanted my work to do. And then, I mean, I had this moment. My first book came out in 2006, but there's always a lag time between, writing the book and it coming out. So
Yeah.
it was in that period, after graduate school, when I was working in Missouri, the town that I was living in called Warrensburg, Missouri, and then that I commuted to, because eventually I moved to Kansas City and commuted out. It's a military Air Force Base town. It's where most of the stealth bombers are housed. And in those early periods of the Iraq War, the missions were actually being flown out of there. So they were flying
Oh,
planes out of Missouri, refueling over Spain, bombing Baghdad, coming back, and then you would sit in the coffee shop next to some guy in a flight suit who 12 hours ago was bombing Iraq. And I thought that war was really problematic for a variety of reasons. And it was very strange to be in this place that was so invested in and dedicated to this military effort, to have so many students who were getting shipped out. I mean, I had students disappear mid-semester all the time,
oh,
come back a couple years later. Suddenly the world I was in didn't feel like it needed as much transformation, because it was already surreal and strange and internally conflicted for me. Especially because I thought there was also a class dynamic. Most of these were working class kids getting shipped out, whereas, rich American kids generally weren't getting shipped out. And so all of that seemed really important for me to think about. And so in The City, Our City, which is my third book, I started thinking about the way in which the historical moment that I was living in could find its way into
yeah.
these poems. And I also started thinking about a little bit like a poet of witness, trying to sort of articulate the present moment I was living in for a future audience as well as for a present audience. And that seemed to me really, really like even though some of the poems might not feel different at that point, to me, conceptually, they were different. I was trying to do something different. And as I've then moved forward in my writing life, I've become interested in sort of trying to do both of those things, trying to think about how an individual life both lives in a domestic world that, unless you're very unlucky, is often untouched by history. But we also live in this shared historical reality in these public places. And I wanted to figure out how both of those things, I still want to figure out how both of those things are true and how we
Yeah.
navigate as individuals. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you just describing the Iraqi war and being a professor at that time, reminded
Yeah.
me of a scene. I think a biopic about Tolkien, where most of his students they were all recruited. I think it was World War I or World War II, and so
Yeah.
that's moment just flashed in my head. Wow,
Yeah.
the title of
Yeah. It was,
your
sorry, go on.
the title, "The End of Childhood," of your book, it has this what's the word now? This uh, dramatic representative feel to it as like it's like the end of childhood. It's doing a lot of work before you even open the book. What does that phrase mean to you? How did it become the anchor for the collection?
Yeah, I think that I wanted it to do two things at once. And I think what I was just saying about the sort of private domestic life and a public historical shared reality that we live in, I liked the idea of the end of childhood as a title for the collection because I thought it could do both of those things at once. On the one hand, the book is thinking about watching my children grow up. I have kids who are 15 and 11, and so when I'm writing that book about 4 years ago, my daughter is just entering adolescence. My younger son is you know emerging into himself, and at the same time, I also think that the phrase can represent, at least for me, the end of a particular kind of American naivete, exceptionalism. I think that the Trump administration has been complicating for a lot of the ways that Americans think about ourselves.
Yeah,
And so I think in this historical moment, there are multiple ends of childhood that are happening, if that makes
yeah,
sense.
yeah. Wow. Was there a single poem in this collection that cracked the whole book open, kind of like the spine of the whole collection? If there's anything like that, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, there's a poem in the book called On Violence. That's there was a kid who was shot in my neighborhood.
Oh,
He was a teenager. It was a gang violence connected sort of thing. He was shot at the bus stop up from my house, and I don't live in like a super rough neighborhood, so it was like particularly surprising that this happened.
yeah,
I mean, Denver in general is a pretty low crime city. And I think that poem, it's in multiple sections. It's a longer poem, is thinking about the way in which we in our present moment are always living on top of multiple layers of violence. I think that that's true. I think that, whether you're thinking about colonialism or war or whatever it is, the 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 plane that we're standing on was in some way created by some form of violence, and the poem is trying to think about how some of that violence gets remembered and how
yeah.
some of it gets immediately erased.
Mm. Wow. And this poem on violence is the poem that showed you what the rest needed to be.
I can't remember the order that how I wrote the book exactly, but it was a poem that I realized formally I could do this thing more effectively than I'd done in the past, with sort of multiple threads
Yeah,
braiding in and out of each other and coming together in a poem. And then I think it's also a poem that captures a lot of the themes in the book, if that makes sense.
yeah. Kind of like a representative of the collective theme of the book.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. What is the relationship between autobiography and imagination in your work? Like how much of Wayne Miller is actually in these poems?
Well, that's an interesting question because even if it's imagination, it's still me, right? Because it's
Yeah,
my imagination. So, I think generally when I'm reading a poet, I'm thinking about the way in which the world around them is getting um, sucked through a kind of machine and spat out the other end.
yeah,
That machine being their mind or their self. You know what I mean? And it gets processed. And I think for some poets, the processing is relatively minimal. And for some poets, the processing is really significant. Um, I think for me, it really depends on the poem. I mean, there are definitely a lot of moments in my poems where I'm making up details. I mean, I'm thinking of one particular poem from my fifth book called Mind Body Problem that is about, and I think this is maybe illustrative of the way I think about this. It's about someone whose partner has a brain tumor. And it's thinking about the relationship of their mind to their body, the way in which they're, when they get goosebumps, that's some version of their mind manifesting on their skin. And yet it feels like the mind and the body are separated from each other. That's, the classic way that we often think about, soul and mind, soul and body, that kind of thing. But at the same time, of course, it's the brain that has the tumor that is killing the person. Well, my wife does not have a brain tumor, but my wife does have an autoimmune condition that she
okay.
has been sick with for a very long time. And we've been to tons of specialists and we've dealt with a lot of medical circumstances. When I started writing the poem, it was about her. And I was thinking about her illness and the way in which her mind and body are related to each other. But at a certain point, I realized that if the poem is called Mind Body Problem, it's much more interesting poetically for the medical condition to be a tumor that is in the mind than for it to be the body. Without the mind, trying to say what I'm trying to say. The mind
Following.
becomes body if there's a tumor, right? And that made the poem more interesting to me. So at a certain point, I think the discovery in writing that poem was that it needed to take this fictional leap for the poem to really inhabit its full self. But to me, it's a very autobiographical poem because it's thinking about the illness that my wife has had since long before we met.
I mean, listening to you talk about the autoimmune, and in a sense, based on what I understand autoimmune to be, when it's like the body is in an attempt to protect itself, it ends up fighting itself. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but that's like that's the definition I remember of it. So, understand that autoimmune, it's like the mind of the body in the sense it's I don't know, the genetics and everything. It's just and then it ends up dealing with the body. So mind, body, though not the literal mind of the head, but the
Hmm.
mind of the body that's
Yes.
supposed to like
Yeah.
protect itself ends up affecting the body. So in a sense, I don't know if I'm making sense. I feel like I'm rambling right now.
No, you're totally making sense. No, that I mean, the more you dig into it, it's an impossible entanglement, and of course that's the thing, right? Is that for all of the work that human beings have done to try to separate the mind from the body, it's very hard for us to do. They are, at least as we experience them, they're 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 inseparable.
Yeah, well, a poem and a short story, they both live or die in a very small space.
Mhm.
What do you
Yeah,
think the two forms share at the level of craft? And where do you think they genuinely diverge? Two roads lead.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think short stories are the hardest things to write, actually.
Mm.
I mean, I never write short stories. I tried when I was really young and, in grad school and I just I can't do it because I think a short story requires the narrative expansiveness of a novel while requiring the compression of a poem. And that middle space, I think, is, for me anyway, an impossible space to inhabit. And I know it when, when you read a great short story. This is the way I talk about this with students, with co-editors whenever we're working on Copper Nickel. A good short story in those first 2 pages, it does about 19 things, and you don't notice it's doing them, and then it's suddenly managed to do them. You've introduced character, you've introduced setting, you've introduced interiority, you've created the sense that the story lives inside a larger world beyond the
Yeah,
story. You've introduced a problem or a conflict that the protagonist is dealing with. You've given us a sense of voice. You've done so many things all at once. And once, I mean, those first 2 pages of a short story are so essential because they set all of that up. It's like pulling back one of those toy cars, and then when you let it go, the wheels take off. I think a poem is, I mean, I'm always wary to generalize about poems because, of course, there are tons of different kinds of poems. There are narrative poems, lyric poems, experimental poems, formal poems, all of these different concepts, and I'm not even sure that they have discrete lines between them. I think they all blur into each other. But I think that the one thing I would say is that I think the line, now granted, there are prose poems too, but the line in a poem allows for a kind of multiplicity, a kind of slipperiness of meaning, because I think the line um, is always pushing and pulling against the sentence and complicating the sentence. So, when you break a sentence in the middle of it, you have a moment where you think you have a complete meaning, and then the rest of the sentence unfolds, and it
yeah,
can complicate that meaning. It can add to that meaning. That momentary pause is a thing that a poem is able to do, that creates slipperiness and multiplicity. And I think, I mean, obviously, stories just don't have that. Stories create um, slipperiness and multiple meanings in different ways with things like irony and symbols. And, they
yeah,
use a different toolkit in that way. But I think you're right in that both require an incredible amount of compression. And in that way, I think if I had to say, is the short story closer to the poem or closer to the novel, I think it's closer to the poem because of the compression.
Oh, the short story is closer to the poem than it is closer to the novel. Oh, earlier on you
I could
talked
be
about
wrong. That's what I think.
earlier you talked about it's crazy how, we talk about poetry and we talk about prose. And sometimes when I read pure prose, not, maybe a novel in this case, and every word just sounds like poetry. Like it just flows. It's like a slippery slope. Once you start, the pages just run into each other and you're like, wow, the words are sweet. Like the way they just flow,
Yeah.
the description of the places, the way, like everything. It's not just, oh, me telling you what happened. It's more like it's a melody and it's prose.
Yeah.
And it's not like it's an
Mhm.
official poem, and I'm like, wow, this is lovely.
Yeah, and I mean, some of the best. I mean, I'm thinking about a novelist like Cormac McCarthy, who I think has an incredible sense of musicality in the language, and I think so much of that is the rhythm of the language. In the
Yeah,
same way that, poets pay attention to their stressed beats. And, I think a certain kind of novelist, a certain kind of story writer, and you don't have to do this to be a good novelist or story writer, but I know what you mean. There's some prose writers that there's just a musicality to the language. And I think often that comes from rhythm, from a real attention to never letting there be more than two slack beats in a row so that we get that feeling of the insistence of poetic language, even though it's in prose.
yeah. Now we're talking about reading, and when I started writing poetry at a very young age, I was curious. How did the people like William Shakespeare do the reading? Is it that you sit there and you say the words out loud and see if there's rhythm and then you write it, or is it that it just comes naturally and you just think it through, like it goes through the mind?
Do you mean in terms of
The rhythm in
reading?
poetry. Yeah, the rhythm.
So my experience of reading other poets?
Reading. That's RHYTHM.
Well, rhythm. I'm sorry, I misheard you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that for a long time, we had these set rhythms. Are you writing an iambic pentameter? Are you writing an trochaic
Yeah.
trimeter? And there's certainly still poets who adhere to that. But I feel like when I'm paying attention to rhythm, I'm usually paying attention to the relationship of strong beats to weak beats, and I'm thinking about never going too far in slack beats and weak
Mm.
beats without hitting a strong beat. And that's what I mean about a fiction writer who has a really strong sense of rhythm. 3 weak beats in a row to me is like the death of the poetic. The moment you get 3 weak beats in a row, that line starts to feel prosy. So yeah, I mean, I'm always excited if I get a submission to Copper Nickel in blank verse and it's beautifully made. I
Yeah.
think that's really, really cool. But I'm certainly not only going to publish work in blank verse, So
Yeah.
for me, and I don't generally write work that's that rhythmically regular. So for me, the main issue is how often we experience strong beats. That to me is the measure of poetry.
Well, earlier on you talked about reading submissions on Copernic and saying that it
Mhm.
takes about the first 2 pages that a short story does a certain kind of things. And
Mhm.
I want us to talk about the first line, especially
Yeah.
as a poet. How important is it? How do you know when you found the right one? And if possible, could you maybe read out your most favorite, first line of poetry you've written?
I do have a copy of my book. Okay. So I feel like I usually know I found the first line when the poem is able to then grow from it. I think that I'm often walking around with a kind of idea, an abstraction in my head, that could become a poem. Maybe it's an image, maybe it's a metaphor, maybe it's a concept that I want to write. I mean, I had in my head for some time that I wanted to write. In Denver, we had a serious. It's improving now because we have a new mayor who I think has done good work. But we had a serious homeless problem for a while, and one of the things that I remember seeing was a number of homeless people in an encampment below the art museum. Well, that to me said something, that juxtaposition, all this beautiful art, this idea of value and the wealth that accompanies it, and this highbrow sense that sitting there and then a homeless encampment below it. I knew that that had to show up in a poem, but I wasn't sure what to do with it. And that's what I mean is it's usually some line arrives that actually unlocks the door to the poem. And that's usually when I know I've found the right first line. Um, I had talked about on violence. I thought I would just read you the first line of that,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
and then, um, and then, but I got to find the page number. Oh, there it is, 31.
Do you mind showing us the book cover for those that are watching on YouTube? Okay.
Okay, it's actually the first 3 lines because they're fairly short lines. So if you look through.
Yeah, I see it.
But it's really the first sentence that opened up the poem for me. And it's up on 29th Avenue. A teenage boy was shot just standing for the bus. In the case of this poem, the poem needed to have enough narrative in it to be able to talk about this particular triggering instant of
Yeah.
this boy being shot, and then what it was going to open up. So I think what I discovered in that opening line and why that was a good opening for me, or those 3 opening lines, is that it was direct and narrative and unadorned and not doing anything complicated. And I think increasingly hearing the language of in my head like that, it's often
Yeah.
very straightforward these days. But it's hearing the language, a sense of rhythm, and that is what opens up the poem for me.
Oh,
And you can see that line gets more rhythmically insistent. Up on 29th Avenue, a boy was shot just
was that
standing for.
intentional?
I don't know how intentional it is or how subconscious it is, but once I see it,
Yeah.
I think it's good, and then I like it. I think that's why the line felt like the right line, is that it moves from slackness to insistence. That's what makes it feel like it's opening the poem.
Oh, how do you know when a poem is? is finished. Not good, but done.
Yeah. So the way this was described to me by my undergrad professor, Stuart Freebert, and I love this metaphor. I don't think it's his. Someone else said this, but I can't remember who he said he heard it from or where he read it. But the idea that making a poem is like building a box and the last line should feel like you closed the lid. I just think that's an amazing metaphor.
Oh,
The I, because it's not that you slam the lid shut. It's not you drive in the last nail. There's a softness to it, but it becomes whole at that moment that the lid is closed. That has always stuck with me since I first heard that in a poetry class, I think my sophomore year in college. And I just think that's a beautiful idea. For me, often I don't know how to explain that feeling when it happens in a poem. Often it's an image that feels like it's slightly deflected from
yeah.
the direction you think the poem is moving, but it feels apt. It feels right. It feels like the box closes.
Have you had poems that lingered on for years?
Yes, often. Yeah, it's Margaret Atwood has a great quote. She says, she's talking about publication, and she says that the
Yeah,
main value of publication is it clears your desk to get to other things. She says the wastepaper basket also works, but far less effectively. And I love that idea because it's true. If you have an idea for a poem, an idea for something to write, and you don't make it work and you just throw it away, it doesn't actually go away. It just sits there. And I've had so many poems that I started, I got three-quarters of the way through, I gave up on, and then 2, 3 years later, I suddenly see something or hear something or have an idea that that's where that needed to go. And then I come back to it and I know what I should do. And often it's then an easy finish for this poem. It just took me 3 years of looking around for the next thing that had to happen. I've also had poems that I've overwritten where, I think the poem is done, but I don't know why it doesn't feel right. And then I realized that, cutting off the last 18 lines was the right thing to do.
yeah,
So, there is a kind of like, it takes a while sometimes to find that feeling of the box being closed. You know what I mean?
yeah. Well, and sometimes you realize that you have two books on one, and so you have to like split the boxes so that they each can be on its own, and and then fully form. And you talk
Mhm.
about one growing into each other. Sometimes two poems come as one, and you have to like disintegrate it when you've written it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I would say too, I think my writing process, a way that it's changed in the last, really since I had kids, I just have less time to write because I have
Yeah,
my wife, a social worker. We're really busy. She works full time. I work full time. So we're constantly juggling. And, increasingly, I mean, I do this now on my phone. I used to have a notebook, but now I do it in the little notes function in my phone. I
yeah,
just, catch little snippets of language, little images, that idea of the homeless camp below the art museum. Like that's just a little note in a notebook, basically. And I have moments where, like at the beginning of the summer, I'm suddenly going to have a little bit more time. I go in and I transcribe all of those notes, all of those fragments that I've written over the last year just into one document. And I think because the way my mind works is pretty obsessive, I'm always thinking about the same thing. I can often take several of those things and thread them. They seem like disparate images, but they're connected. They're connected by the things that I was obsessing over in the world. And part of the fun of writing is figuring out how they're connected. And I don't remember why I said that. It had to do with your question, but I can't remember now.
yeah. I
Um,
talk about disintegrating a poem because some
yeah, yeah.
poems come as two in one instead of just one.
Yeah, and in this case, I think often, I guess I'm reversing that. Often I think that I have multiple things that seem separated, but actually, yeah, they're connected. And part of my writing process is finding the ways in which they're connected.
Yeah. Well, what's your revision process? Do you write first and then revise slowly, or is it the draft itself that's a slow, deliberate act, and you're trying to make every word perfect before the poem forms itself.
I'm usually trying to make every word perfect as I'm making the poem, and then I come back to it and realize I failed at doing that, and then I continue
Uh,
to revise it. I also, I've worked. I mean, my closest friend in the poetry world is a poet named Kevin Proofer, and Kevin and I have been swapping poems for God, for 20, almost 25 years now, and so I mean, almost all of my poems, when I have a draft that I think I'm happy with, I show them to Kevin. He writes more than me. So then I have one poem and he has three poems, and we swap them and each talk about them to the other person. And then, and usually, it's always the same things. He tells me, "Oh, you overwrote this metaphor. This one doesn't really quite line up. I think your rhythm is a little slack here." And I tell him my versions of the same kinds of things, and then I
yeah,
make a final version, send them out. And I will say, I think this is where the publication process, the process of sending out, is really valuable because I think a poem's done, I send it out, and that separates it from me for a while. It sits out there with some editor. And when it comes back to me rejected, then I have a moment to revisit it and to say, okay, did I get this right? And that editor is wrong. It just doesn't land with that editor for whatever reason, but I got this
yeah,
poem right and I'm not going to change anything. Or maybe that editor is right. And, maybe this needs to be revised further. So whenever poems come back to me, I revisit them and think about if I need to change. It's something I say to all my students. I say that the hardest thing for a writer is you're going to get all sorts of advice from editors, from friends and workshops,
yeah,
from all these people are going to tell you what to do with your poems. And your success as a writer ultimately is going to hinge on when you decide to listen to that advice and when you decide not to. And that's the one thing no one can tell you. Um,
yeah,
and so, but I always feel like you have to be open to the advice. You have to be open to the editor's no. They might be right. And you
mm,
also have to be willing to stick to your guns and think they're wrong. You have to live in that space of uncertainty where either of those things could be true, and then you have to make your choice. And that choice might change over time. When a poem comes back to me 10 times from 10 different editors, I start to think maybe they're right. Um,
yeah.
but,
It's
you know, but
yeah,
I'll also
it's
say that the poem in my first book that I still like the most is the only one in that book that was never published in a magazine. Editors didn't like it. I think they're wrong. I think it's one of the two or three best poems in the book. So, like no one can
yeah,
tell you how to navigate that.
it's crazy because to get to hear that an editor like yourself also gets rejected.
Right.
For most people, one would assume, you know how we have assumptions like, oh yeah, it's an editor, he usually does the rejecting most of the time, which you do on Copernic,
Mhm.
but now someone else gets to also do it to you. So to all the writers who submitted to Copernic and their work has not been published, yeah.
I think it's
uh,
worth saying too that we reject tons of really good work. I mean, we receive about 16,000 poems a year, and we publish about 50. There are a lot of good poems that we receive that we don't take. And as an editor who's also a writer, I get rejected all the time.
yeah,
All of my colleagues who I edit with, we're also writers. We get rejected all the time. And I do think it's true. I really do believe that if you're persistent and also receptive to criticism, if both of those things are true, good work does most of the time get picked up, but it takes a while. And it takes
mm,
longer if you're not known. If you don't have a name, it's much easier to get published if you're really famous,
yeah,
or even if you're, than if you're not. Um, but I think that, I just think that there are so many good magazines. There's so many good editors doing good work. There's so many good writers. There are just too many good writers. And so it's a big shuffle. Um, and work is getting shuffled and hopefully the good work lands. And I think usually it does. I really do believe that.
yeah. Oh. And what are some of the things you notice in, I guess, the common patterns you see in a work that's promising, but for some reason just fails to land.
I think often the work that doesn't land with me feels like it's only three-quarters committed to what it's doing. It just hasn't leaned all the way in to what it's doing. I'll tell you a little anecdote about this that I tell students that I think about when I'm thinking about this idea of committing fully to the idea of a piece or to what a piece is trying to do. There's a fiction writer named Deb Olin Unferth, who's a wonderful fiction writer, if people haven't read her. And I was once on a panel with her in San Francisco where she told this story, and I love this story. So she was a graduate student. And she'd written a short story in which a character and her friends go out for Halloween. I
Yeah,
apologize to Deb for stealing this story, but I'm stealing it. Um, uh, they go out on Halloween, and it's a typical sort of Halloween. They're walking around. They are in costumes. They get candy, but in the middle of this, they encounter a dead body. And then they just continue. They don't know what to do with it. And they just continue with their night. And everyone, this was in graduate school. Deb was in graduate school, and in the workshop, the students all said, "This doesn't work. They can't find a dead body. Like it just doesn't work." And she went to the professor afterwards, and she said, "Do you think they're right? Do you really think it doesn't work as a story?" And he said, "Yeah, it doesn't work as a story because they only find one body." But what if they found 30 bodies? What if everywhere they go, they find a body? What if they go home and there's a body on the porch? What if they go in the backyard and there's a body? What if there's a body hanging from a tree? What if there's a body in the street? They get in a taxi cab, there's a body. Now,
yeah,
what he said is, you got to push the story farther. You had this idea that basically underneath the suburbs lies a body, right? But you tried to keep it realistic, and that didn't work. You got to push it
yeah,
far. What if they find 100 bodies? And I always just think of that as instructive. So there's a poem that we published in Copper Nickel by a guy named Brandon Amico called Sestina. And so, Sestina, right, has repeating words at the end of the lines. Well, this Sestina, the last word of every line for the entire Sestina is Kansas. Um, and this is what I mean about really leaning into it. I'll read you the first stanza. So this is a sestina because the words do repeat, but of course it's the same word repeating in the pattern, so you don't notice it. But he says, "What of the country, the heartland, the homeland is Kansas. The thicket of my language grows forth from Kansas. Owner, worker, and the wheat, what binds them spring from Kansas. Broken windows, stuttered sprinkler systems abide Kansas." It just keeps going, Kansas, Kansas. The entire poem, every line ends in Kansas.
yeah.
That's what I mean. The the weak version of that poem would not have decided to do that. It would have tried to
Wow.
talk about Kansas, and it would have used the word enough that we got the idea that yes, okay, you're from Kansas and you're writing about, the boring Midwestern heartland. The idea that he decided to make it a sestina and end every line with Kansas is that formal insistence that I just think is really brilliant in that poem. It also makes the poem hilarious, and fun, and it's playing with form. It's leaning fully into what the poem wants to be. And I think a lesser poet would have decided not to lean in that hard. So those are like two illustrations of what I mean by leaning in. That idea of like committing fully to the idea of what the poem or the story is trying to be. I think that's the committing to the point of originality, maybe is a way to say it too. The problem with finding one body is it's not that original. Find 30 bodies on Halloween. No one's written that story. So, yeah, it's that place where form and argument and idea and originality meet. And often that's the place where the writer really leans in.
Yeah, I think there's a quote. I can't remember the author that said this. It's along the lines of know the rules and then break the rules.
Yeah.
In order to break the rules, you have to know them. So, looking at the story, you ask, okay, what's the rule? And then, okay, you can't find a body. That doesn't really work. and then go ahead and break it. Actually,
Correct. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Totally. Or it's like the music version of that, right? Is the jazz musician learns all the scales so he can forget them when he's soloing, right?
yeah. Well, has editing thousands of submissions changed how you write? Has it made you more ruthless with your?
Did you say has reading the submissions, has that
Has
changed how?
editing thousands of
Yeah.
submissions changed how you write?
Yeah.
Has it made you more ruthless with your?
Um, yes, in that I find it hard to write when I'm in the real heart of the editing season because, I mean, so much of my job is saying no, and figuring out the right moment to say no. So I'm reading quickly. It's a superficial kind of reading on a first round. I'm really reading to pay attention to language and rhythm and image. And I mean, the thing that I'm always asking myself is how interestingly is this poet using the toolkit? Um, and it's not the same as a leaning back, quiet, engagement with the
Yeah,
work. And so I find it hard to write in that time. And when I'm doing that, I scrutinize my own work so much that I find it hard to make something happen.
yeah,
Uh, and also I'll say, that's like the negative version of it. I think the positive version of it is that I can really see I feel like I'm a little bit like on a vantage, like on a mountaintop. When I'm editing, I can sort of see all of the poetry world out there. Whereas at my desk in my room, I'm only reading or in my little office, I'm only reading the things that I want to read. I'm not seeing as much as I'm being asked to see when I'm editing. And so, I can sort of see the way. Now, this doesn't really affect my own work, but it makes me think about how my work interacts with the world of poetry. I can see the way we're all kind of moving, like a flock of birds or something. Like each bird is making one choice, but then you see the whole thing in movement. And, it's really interesting to see the way poems looked really different 15 years ago, what people were writing than what they're writing now. The interests have
yeah.
changed, the formal choices have changed, and they're going to change again. And I just find that so fascinating. It's a really cool place to be, to sort of to see the landscape of poetry. But I'll also say, like, I'm not trying to chase trends. I think that's sort of the death knell of poetry. So if everyone is writing in one direction, that doesn't mean I'm going in that direction. But it does make me think, okay, I'm really outside the trend now, whereas 5 years ago, maybe I wasn't, or whatever that looks like. And that helps me think about, well, maybe when I send my work out, it's going to be harder to place.
Well, well, thank you so much. This has been a lovely conversation. What are you reading right?
Actually reading, I'm reading uh, Robert Graves, his World War One memoir, Goodbye to All That. That's my like book I'm reading because I've never read it, and it's a classic that I'm reading, before I go to sleep.
Yeah.
And then I'm reading, what am I reading? I picked up a whole bunch of poetry books.
Apart from the submission,
Oh, I'm done with the submission pile for now.
okay.
Um, I'm in summer. I have to read other things. But I'm reading a really nice new poetry collection by Kathy Fagan. And it is called The Unbecoming. I just totally blanked on the name of it there for a second.
Well,
I'm about halfway through that. That's a beautiful book, just out from Norton. And then I can't remember the writer's name. I bought a book from Zephyr Press at AWP that I've been dipping in and out of, by a Chinese poet I hadn't heard of. And I am absolutely blanking on her name. But anyway, it's a really interesting book, and unlike Chinese translations I've read recently, I'll email you when I go and find the name of it. It's on my desk at the office at work, not at home, which is why I can't just grab it here and look at it.
okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm always
Uh,
reading a couple of things, so
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And what are you working?
I am just trying to write new poems right now. And I have a couple ideas for essays. I at a certain point I have a moment where I realize I'm writing into a book where I've written a bunch of poems and now I can start to see how they connect thematically and okay, what else, if this is going to be a book, what does it need? But I'm not really there. I'm just writing new poems and I'm not sure where they're going.
Wow. Thank you so much, Wayne. This has been a lovely conversation and amazing having a chat with you and just making sense of the short form, right? Yeah, where can listeners learn more about your book and also connect?
My website is waynemillerpoet.com, and you can find all sorts of stuff there. I'm also on Instagram at Wayne Miller Poet and on Facebook at I think it's Wayne Miller the real Wayne Miller Poet or Wayne Miller the real poet. I had someone take over my website or my Facebook page, a hacker, and so I've redone it. So it has a name that's something like Wayne Miller the actual poet or the real poet. But yeah, so I'm, in those social media spaces, but my website, waynemillerpoet.com is probably the best place to go. Or you can go to Copper Nickel, copper-nickel.org and see all the work my co-editors and I are doing there.
Yeah, I'll put the links in the description so listeners can click and go directly to the site. Thank you so much, Wayne. This has been a lovely conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for all your questions and for inviting me to do this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for listening to BuildWriting. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and share it with a friend who loves poetry and creative writing. Leave us a quick review or rating. It really helps others find the show. You can also connect with me, and I'd love for you to subscribe to the newsletter. He's saying all the behind the scenes things I'm experimenting on and things I'm working on in terms of creative writing. Yeah, it'll mean a lot to me. And I shared the writing prompts, behind the scenes, pics, and more. Yeah, a lot of things. And if you have any questions or ideas, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be sure to respond. Love to hear from you. Next week, we'll be diving into something really, really amazing. And you have to tune in next week to find out what that will be. Until next time, keep writing, keep building your craft. See you next time.